Hey everyone, this is Mark. Before I start, as usual, I'm gonna check that you can even hear me, hopefully see me, who knows. Oh yeah, I think that's me. Before I start. Yep, okay, well it's definitely working, which is great. And whether you're joining me live today or whether you're watching the playback, thank you for doing so. It's always really lovely and an honor that you take time out of your very busy lives to spend some time with us here at your Yoga Flow and hopefully these weekly live development sessions are helpful. If you're new to them, sometimes they are practices, sometimes they are discussions or sort of workshop type things to dive a little bit deeper into some of the elements of the courses. And so today, our live is about peak pose planning. This came up because there's been a few questions lately and happened in the past, and I know that it's addressed in certain areas of the courses, but sometimes it's hard to go back and find exactly what you're looking for if you're not sure where it is. So I thought this might be useful for some of you who are at this certain point in your practicum planning. So peak poses. So we're going to talk about what they are and a few ways that you might choose to teach them in your practicum class or in your classes out there in the world, because a lot of you are already teachers. So I think that this might be particularly relevant for people who are in the 175-hour advanced course because one of the requirements of that particular practicum, the 175-hour course, is to teach a practicum class with a peak pose. So that's already wrapped in there. This isn't the case for the 200-hour practicum or for any of the other smaller courses, but it can be a useful and easy, I guess we could say easy is relative, but another way that you could choose to sequence your practicum class. But just a note, not required, peak pose class not required for 200-hour practicum, but you might choose to do it. Yes, required for the 175-hour practicum, so you definitely have to do it. And in the 175-hour program, there's certain a selection of poses you can choose from. You have to choose one of those particular poses as your peak pose. So if you're in that course, you probably, if you're at that point, you already sort of know. If you're not in that course, don't worry about it, unless you're going to take it and then you'll find out. So in my experience and in my own teaching, I do tend to use a lot of peak pose sequences just because I find it's a fairly easy way to structure my classes. And for me, in terms of a sequence planning perspective, I just kind of like the way it's organized. But there are other ways to sequence a class. So we'll talk about the other ways. So we've got peak pose classes. That's one particular type of class. The other classes, the poses might be selected around a particular intention or a desire. Maybe you're sequencing a hatha class for hips. And so you choose a lot of hip opening poses, and there's not necessarily in this type of class a pose that you're working towards. It could just be a lot of different poses together and sequenced in a really nice way. But I found that things sort of tend to, Amy says she loves using peak poses. Yeah, me too. Totally agree. Sometimes things lean in a certain direction, and the word, the phrase peak pose, again, is relative. So for some people, downward dog might be a peak pose. Or warrior 3 is a peak pose in some classes, and then in other classes, it's a warm-up pose. So when we are thinking about peak pose planning, have in mind that that's relative depending on the student and on the level of class that you're teaching. So we've got peak pose planning, we have intention planned classes, we might have philosophically themed classes that the pose is sort of centered around a chakra, things like this. So there are different ways of planning. So don't panic if you're like, I've never heard of peak pose before. Don't worry about it. If you're doing a 200-hour practicum, just select a bunch of poses that go really well together, where there's a nice flow, and you're great. So what is a peak pose? If you're not sure, a peak pose is a pose or a set of poses that happen at the peak of your sequence. So this generally tends to be a pose or an asana you're working towards. So that might mean that it's maybe more challenging. It might be a really challenging asana. That's not always the case, and we just talked about that before. It could be maybe a fairly common asana that's held for a really long period of time. But in my experience, it tends to be a little bit more challenging, like we're working up to something. When does it happen in a class? It depends. I think generally around like the 2/3, 3/4 mark. So if we think about the arc of a yoga class, let's see if you can see here, we're starting pretty slow, and then we're warming up, and then we're maybe in standing poses, getting a bit more challenging. Here's our peak pose, and then we start to kind of think about cooling down, softening down. We've got some hip poses, and then we're, on our backs, and my finger went out of view, but now it's back to here. So it's at this point, the top point, the climax of the class. But that point is going to vary depending on the type of class you're teaching. So what can peak poses be? Anything. Anything can be a peak pose. And you might notice that there's certain poses that are more likely to be a peak pose, like half moon or revolved half moon, dancer's pose, arm balances like crow pose, handstand, headstand, side crow. These are all sort of generally, I would consider them peak poses, like things that need to be, you're not just going to start a class in crow. You're going to need to work up to crow and to explore the body and to explore different elements of crow. So it's more likely going to be a peak pose. If you started a class with crow, that might be really challenging. But other poses could be peak poses. Plank pose could be a peak pose, and you could hold it for a really long period of time. That might make it feel a little bit more like a peak. Chair pose, holding chair for a really long period of time, again, might be a peak. So your peak pose might be, in this, let's say, for example, half moon. That's like one complex, challenging pose. But, like I just said before, it could also be a pose that you hold for a long period of time, just sort of a more common pose. Or it could be a sequence of poses strung together. So you might be doing a peak pose class, maybe let's say it's a flow class, and you're working on stringing 3 poses together at the peak of your class. These are your peak poses. So you've got standing splits, into warrior 3, back to high lunge, back to standing splits, forward fold. Other side, we're in forward fold, standing splits, warrior 3, high lunge, back to standing splits, forward fold. So Amy's saying she teaches yoga, and at the moment we work on one challenging peak pose each half term, working towards it over the 6 weeks. I can't expand your comment, Amy. Let's see if I can. I don't want to mess anything up on here. Oh, Seymour. They enjoy that more than a peak pose per class, but that goes hand in hand with boosting self-confidence in the long term. Yeah, that's a really neat idea too. You're teaching teen yoga. So Amy's teaching teen yoga. So they're working on one peak pose each half term. I love that idea. That's great when you have a group of students who you're committed to working with for a period of time. So in Amy's example, teaching in a school, I'm assuming. But if you teach classes in a community center as well, sometimes those are paid for in a block. So students sign up for a 6-week block of vinyasa flow classes every Wednesday at 8 a.m. with you. And that's another nice way to be able to do things like what Amy's doing, which is breaking things down over a longer period of time. So that's great. So peak poses could be strung together into a sequence as well. So, and that sounds challenging to me. Forward fold, standing splits, warrior three, high lunge, back to standing splits. That would be a good challenge for me. So that's sort of the overview of what peak poses might be and how you might incorporate them into your practicum class or into your public classes. So now we get to the really fun part. And I think for some of you, this might be really great in terms of sequencing and planning. And for others, maybe you'd be like, it's not my favorite way to think about it. But I think it is a really great way to sequence classes. So how do you sequence a class for teaching a peak pose? I love this part because this is where your knowledge of anatomy, but not just anatomy, like remembering, you don't need to remember names of muscles or bones or things like this, but anatomy in the terms of the parts of the body, whether you know the name or not, it doesn't super matter, but the parts of the body that are working in your peak pose. So I know that for a lot of people in the anatomy part, they're always a little bit worried about remembering the names, and you don't need to remember all of the names. Some of them you already know or will stay with you, but don't panic. It's more about remembering or just feeling, I guess, kinesthetically parts of the body that are working in the peak pose. So to begin with, you need to think about the elements that are important for doing your peak pose. So as an example, let's say our peak pose is going to be dancer's pose. So we know that in dancer's pose, first off, there's a balance element. There's a chest and a shoulder opening because we're holding that back foot. So this chest, part of the chest and the shoulders opening. We know that there's kind of a stretch in the hip. Anatomically, we might call that a hip extension because we're holding that back leg, that back foot. And then we're kicking back, so that back hip's going to feel a stretch. There's a back bend element as well. So there's kind of an extension in the spine. And there's a strengthening element in the standing leg, the leg that's staying rooted on the mat, or the foot that's staying rooted on the mat will be supporting all of the weight. So notice that we didn't have to think about muscles that are working or being stretched or anything like that. You can if that's your strength, but we can also just talk about actions in the body. So those are the things that we know we need to have in place for teaching dancer's pose as a peak pose. And I teach dancer's pose as a peak pose a ton in my Hatha and gentle Hatha classes. So that's step one. It's like figure out what needs to be, what we need to be working, what's going to be working in our peak pose. And then we work backwards a little bit. So now we choose poses for our sequence that lead up to this to prepare the body for dancer's pose. What that might look like, in my example that I did write down earlier, is we might look at doing lunges. Lunges because if we're in a low lunge shape, we're getting a nice stretch for that back hip, just like we will in dancer's pose. We might explore back bends because there's a back bend element in dancer's pose. So things like cobra, sphinx, locust, these are all great. We might think about playing with arm binds, just interlacing the hands together behind in like a forward fold or even just standing. Because this element, this rotation of the shoulder and this opening of the chest is something we're looking for in dancer's pose. We know there's a balance element in dancer's pose, so we're going to think about maybe checking our balance. We might look at tree pose as a great way towards, the midway point of the class to see like, how is our balance today? So we check in with that element. And then because of this, there's a strengthening part of this pose with the foot and the leg that are staying stationary on the mat. Things like chair pose, ways to awaken our legs and holding chair pose for a little bit to really get that energy and that strength drawing up through the body. And then we think about those things and we just sequence them together. So if this were me teaching dancer's pose as a peak pose, I'd start seated. I'd do some seated stretches, maybe, some of the side bend things, maybe even exploring the bind right off the bat there. And then I'd move to tabletop and I'd do some cat-cow, and then a low lunge and a low lunge, and then maybe a downward dog. And then I'd come and do Sphinx for a few breaths just to start getting into some back bends and maybe a couple of baby cobra lifts. And then I go back to downward dog, maybe forward fold, come to stand, maybe doing tree pose. And then I might do a few sun salutation A's just to really warm up the body to explore the back bends that are in sun salutation A, the cobra or the up dog. And so we're warming up. And then I might think about, what else? Oh, I might do some high lunges from standing, just to, again, awaken the legs to get that hip stretch that's required for dancers. Maybe warrior 3 is like a nice other balance element, or tree pose again. And then sort of based on that, we're kind of ready for dancer's pose. So then I'd explore dancer's pose maybe 1 or 2 times. If it's a peak pose, I tend to try it a couple of times, and then we cool down. So it's actually, for me, at least at this point in my teaching, just a really easy way to figure out what I'm going to teach, because I work backwards a little bit. We take the peak pose, what it is we're working towards, and then we kind of figure out a way to get there that has us ready to go. And a lot of people teach this way. You may not even realize sometimes that you're being led towards a peak pose. And those are classes that I love because they're confusing in a great way. Sometimes I've been in a class where the teacher has had us doing things where my mind can't even imagine where we're going. And then we end up in this other place doing a pose I've never heard of or a variation I never thought of. And so it can be a really great way to keep interest in your classes too. Okay, so that's sort of the first part of this, which is what is a peak pose and how do we sequence for it? And just before we move on, if you were doing this in sort of, say you had your peak pose was a string of sequences, you would just make sure that all of those poses in that peak sequence were accounted for in the lead up to it. Okay, so now comes the part that we need to think about. And how are we going to teach this peak pose in our class? For me at least, there's 2 ways. Will we integrate it into the flow of the class so that, like I was just talking about before, that students aren't really aware that it's even happening. We just sort of are leading up to it in a really smooth way, and then we arrive at the peak pose, we try the peak pose, and then we start to cool down and relax and finish the class. That's one way. The other way is we teach this pose a little bit more like a workshop. So we stop the flow of the class, essentially, and we say, okay, we're going to try this, and we might try it a few times. There's that beautiful element of fun and play. So in Sanskrit, I think the word for play is lila. So there's this, I guess it's like in a movie or TV show when they break that fifth wall. And it can work really well sometimes when we step outside of the energy that we've created and enjoy and laugh and connect together a little bit more, like a class and a community. And that is the other way that you could teach a peak pose. So for the purposes of your 200-hour practicum, if you are choosing to peak pose sequence, I recommend keeping it simple, just incorporating the peak pose into the flow of the class. So not thinking about having to teach it like a workshop or anything like that. In the 175-hour practicum, the poses that you choose, that you can choose from for your peak pose are a little complicated. So you might think about teaching them in a little bit more of a workshop way. Why? Well, one thing to consider, and you don't have to in the 175-hour practicum because you may be on your own in a room and it's a little strange for some of us, but if you are out there teaching crow pose, for example, I want to make sure in my class that everybody feels comfortable. So I want to make sure that I offer enough variations and options that everybody can stay in a place where they're safe. And with some complicated poses like crow pose, the variations and the modifications aren't as simple as other types of shapes. And I'll talk about why. So let's say, first of all, teaching a peak pose in the flow of the class. Dead easy. Just basically what we talked about with dancer's pose. We're slowly building up to it. We've got all the elements worked into our sequence. We arrive at dancer's pose. And then what do? We just teach dancer's pose. We can keep everything the same. Cue it just like we would cue all the other things. No need to stop. If we were choosing to teach this in a workshop style, peak pose, because maybe we were teaching a beginner's class. And I'm just going to stand up in case. So what I might do, I'm teaching my peak pose. So I say, okay, so we've arrived at this moment where we're going to explore this really fun, interesting pose called dancer's pose. And we have, maybe you realize, or maybe you didn't, we've kind of worked on all the elements that we need to explore this shape. But first of all, I'd like you all to grab your chair. So I'm assuming that all of my students prepared and we had our chair. And so I might teach it the first time with a chair, with the hand on the chair. And so then I'm going to have my students bring their left hand onto the chair, bend their right leg, bring their right heel to glute, and then maybe take a hold of that. And then we would try the first time here. And I would do it on both sides. And okay, so now, here we are. You can opt to do the exact same thing again or to step away from your chair. So those who are playing around with a chair, just in your own time, just take that same variation again and just notice what it's like a second time. If you're opting to try this without the chair, bring your right hand down, bend your right knee, take a hold of your right foot, bring your left arm up. With whichever variation you're in, just continue to breathe and to notice what your body's doing. And then we might do it a third time. Maybe we try it at a wall or something like that. And then so we've done it 2 or 3 times. We've explored it a little bit more like a workshop. So the intonation of your voice might change a little bit. You might have your students they might start talking a little bit or laughing, or you can make jokes, things like this. And then I might say, okay, so that was great. Dancer's pose, wonderful. Let's come back to stand at the top of the mat. We're going to start to flow our way down into a child's pose to rest. So inhale, sweep the arms up, and then boom, we're back into that flow of the class again. So I broke it for a few moments, and then now we're back together. We're breathing, we're moving, we're starting to rest and cool down. So that's sort of what I mean by a workshop style. It's also a really good way, I'm out of breath now, as a yoga teacher, to start to practice what it's like to lead a workshop. Because workshops are great because you can charge more, and it can be whatever you want it to be and whatever your interests are and your strengths are. But it is a different way to lead a practice. So it's a good way to practice this element of teaching yoga. Now, the other reason I'm standing up, I'm not sure. I was going to talk about crow pose. So in crow pose, for example, because it is a lot more complicated, I might start everybody in boat pose. So we're teaching this in a workshop style. So I've got all of my students, I guess we're at this point in downward dog, and I'll say, bring your knees down to the mat and take a rest in child's pose. And then now we'll kind of break into that workshop type element. So for the next few moments, we're going to be playing around, and I always try and incorporate the word play to just make everybody realize it's going to be a little bit more fun and interactive. I'm going to be playing with this great pose called crow pose. Now, this is an arm balance pose, so if you have any injuries or discomfort in wrists, shoulders, upper body, we'll start with boat pose to awaken the core, and this is where you continue to play. So everybody come to sit on your mat, and then I cue them into boat pose, and we're holding it for a little bit, and we're playing. And then I might say, okay, so if you're choosing not to explore crow pose today, you're gonna stay in boat pose. You're gonna do a few repetitions, and I'd like you just to play around with moving your arms side to side as you're in it. You can hold it for as long or as short as you would like. And we're just gonna be playing as we do this with moving the upper body side to side to really strengthen our core here. And then I'm gonna let those students continue to play around with boat. And then I'll say, now if you're curious about coming into crow pose, let's come into a squat position at the top of the mat. Have your toes turned out, bend your knees, bring your hands down, and then I'll cue them into crow. And then I'll have those students we'll lean forward. If you're in boat pose, just continue to take breaks as needed. So I'm letting them know that they're still taken care of, and then coming back to my crow students, and then you might start to lean forward, keep pressing into your hands, pick one heel up and then the other, and then the other, and then the other, and then everybody just take a breath for a moment. We'll rest either in child's pose or just sit seated. If you're in boat pose, just close your eyes in a seated position for a moment. So I'm just using this moment as a way to sort of gather how everybody's doing. And then I might say, let's come back into this one more time. So boat pose again. One more time, you can take your favorite variation, or we're gonna come back into a crow pose. So when you're ready, super mindfully, knowing you can, if you're in crow and you're done, you can come back to boat or child's pose, wherever you need to be. And my friends coming into crow pose, in your own time, start to shift forward, either keep both feet on the mat or lift one heel or both heels up. And then I'll be moving around the class, just checking with students how they're doing. Okay, so when you're ready, whichever shape you're in, slowly find your way into a child's pose shape. And so child's pose is the place where I'm bringing everybody back. I'll draw attention to the breath. Close your eyes, just let all that energy melt out of your body and let your breath start to relax and soothe your mind and your nervous system. And then we're back. We're back into the flow of the class, and then I'll start to close the class down and to kind of guide people out of it. So that's sort of what I mean by workshop style peak pose. I really love teaching peak poses that way, especially when they're a little bit more complex, because I find that if I teach sort of like a crow pose in the flow of a class and only do it once, that's really challenging for people who are new to that type of shape, or, it's really hard to sort of give an option for people who can't put any weight on their wrists or just aren't interested in arm balances for various reasons. So when the modifications and the variations and the options are so different, I find that a workshop style just opens up the possibility where I can be a little bit more, attentive and not so in the flow, which can sometimes feel a little panicky or awkward because things move by so quickly. So, and I'm sure if you speak to other teachers, there's probably tons of other ways to do this. These are just the ways that I've found helpful over the years, ways of teaching these sort of peak poses. So that's it for me today. I hope that was useful for some of you. You can put your questions in the comments, because I know that there might be some, and I'll answer what I can, however I can. And just to reiterate again, if you're maybe just catching the end of this, the peak pose sequencing I find super helpful, not necessary at all in your yoga classes. If you're in the 175-hour program, yes, as part of the practicum, peak pose sequencing is required. And you have a selection of peak poses to choose from. But other than that, it's totally up to you. And that's the beauty of yoga, is we can choose to teach in a way that feels authentic to us and to our students, and in a way that feels easy for us. We want our sequencing and our class planning to be something that's manageable. So Amy here. One of my favorite classes I went to when I started my yoga journey had a crow workshop peak pose in it. It was so helpful because I could take that information home and really work on every stage of it. Yes, I love. Thank you for sharing that. I love to hear that too, because I think that it can be such a helpful thing to teach poses in this way if we have the time and the sort of the studentship for that. Oh, and Lorraine, thank you. I'm still doing the 200 hour, but very interested in seeing how to incorporate a workshop into a class. That's great, Lorraine. Yes, before I end, I know I'm just running close to time. One of the most favorite classes I ever took was in Toronto with a teacher there who taught, I think it was like a Jiva Mukti style. And every class was like an hour and a half. And it was basically like 50-ish minutes of pure flow, preparing the body for a peak pose. And then we like go to the wall and do something super fun. Maybe it was working on handstands, or maybe it was doing weird, crazy things where we crawled across the floor with blankets. It was just always so interactive. And I always loved that, looking forward to that workshop element. And then it was complete rest and relaxation and chanting at the end. And it just always felt like I got everything that I needed out of the class. I got the, oh, Amy knows Jiva Mukti too. Oh, you do 3 classes a week? That's wonderful. It's so hard to find classes in some places in the world. So you're very lucky. You have those close by, so you're able to take them. But just, it always had that element of like mindful movement and connection to breath and body and checking in. And then that fun, interactive community workshop element. And then just this glorious long Shavasana. And then Thai, thanks Mark, peak pose makes it easier to reverse engineer the rest of the class. Totally, 100% Thai. So that's everything for today. I hope this was useful, and as always, it's such a pleasure to spend this time with you all, and thank you for commenting and making this interactive and fun for me and hopefully for all of you. So I'll see you all next time. Take care. Bye.